Good morning. We continue this journey through Lent, through the valley, turning to the book of Esther in the Old Testament today. Esther is one of three books. They're all right together in the Old Testament. You have Ezra and Nehemiah that precede Esther, and then Esther. They're all grouped together there. They all take place approximately the same time. They're in the same time frame. The Israelite people have been taken into exile. They're in Persia, and the king Xerxes, you'll find his name listed as Xerxes and Ahasuerus interchangeably. It's the same person, just one. He's known by both names there, and I suspect that the different countries that it's a different take on his name, but it's the same person, Xerxes and Ahasuerus. The cast, as I said, this takes place in the same period of time, but different setting. Ezra and Nehemiah are in the time that the Jews have been started to allowed to return to Jerusalem. And in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, you have the rebuilding of Jerusalem, and more specifically, the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. Esther takes place in the same time frame, but Esther takes place in Persia, with the people, the remnant that has chosen to remain in exile. The cast of characters, there's Esther. Esther is a orphan. She comes from the tribe of Benjamin. Her mother and father had died, and she's been raised by Mordecai, a cousin, an older cousin. And then there's Haman, and of course the king. Haman, I thought this was interesting. Haman is his ancestry takes him back to the Amalekites, and you recall that the Amalekites were a source of conflict. Saul did not wipe them out, and they had remained a thorn in Israel's side. I think that plays into his being the villain in this story. But it occurred to me as I was looking at this that means that Haman was also an exile. If his heritage goes back to the Amalekites, their homeland was in the area around Israel, because they had not been sent out. There are two versions of the story of Esther. There's the shorter version that we find in our Bibles, but there's a longer version that has its influence by the Greeks. And so in the Catholic Bible and the Greek Orthodox Bible, you have a longer version of this same story. Now, I don't know what's included or what's not included in our version of it. Another thing that seems to be somewhat puzzling is that when the king issues a decree, that that's the way it is. The king can't change his mind and go back and say, "Oh, I didn't mean that. Disregard that law." And so any decrees that were issued were unchangeable, and we find that playing out here in this story. And the reason for that is that the kings were considered to be deity. They were gods, and a god did not change their mind. So once the decree was issued, they couldn't go back and change it. But we'll find as we look at this story that there is a way around that. The story unfolds that the king, probably somewhat intoxicated, gets upset with his queen. He wants her to come, he wants to show her off. Exactly what that entailed, don't really know, but she refused. And because she refused, he decided, well, you're no longer my queen, I divorce you. And then it says later that he kind of wished that he hadn't acted so quickly. That goes into that unchangeable decree there. And so he goes about finding a new queen. And that's when Mordecai gets involved, and he starts preparing Esther to be auditioned for this role of being the new queen. It's not often talked about, but in preparing Esther to go and present herself to the king, there's two factors at work here. One, there is Esther's beauty, and Mordecai sees to it that she has every enhancement that is available to make her beauty shine. She spends the night with the king, so there's a sexual side to this. That in finding favor, number one, she had to be pretty. Number two, she had to sexually satisfy the king in order to win his favor. And she accomplishes that and becomes the queen. And then Haman comes on the scene. He's upset with the Israelite people. Now, think back to what I said about his ancestry and the conflict between the Israelites and the Amalekites. Saul had done everything in his power, or tried to eradicate the Amalekites. And so you can see that there would be some animosity there between Haman and the Jewish remnant. And it's unclear at this point whether he knew that Esther was a Jew, because she reveals that later on to the king. Whether or not Haman knew it or not is not really clear. It's sort of insinuated that he did know, and that was that the root or a part of his plan was not only to rid the area of the Jews, but also to get rid of Esther. You have to also go over and think about how the Jewish people had assimilated into the Persian society. If you go over and look at Daniel, in the book of Daniel, you find that Daniel and his friends, that they set themselves aside and not eat the king's food, and then they become very influential within the Persian government. They're appointed to positions of power, and so that would also have been at work here, as Haman is plotting to get rid of the Jews. And so he comes up to the king, and he, sort of like a child, he says, if I found favor with you, would you do something for me, king? And then he goes on to say that there's this group that is planning to overthrow the king, and he wants the king to give him the authority to go and wipe them out. That sounds good to the king, so he says, sure. And so he gives him a letter of authorization and decrees that it will be so. And this letter is translated and posted throughout the kingdom, that on such and such a day that the Persians are to seek these Jews out and to kill them, exterminate them. It's at this point that Mordecai goes into action and convinces Esther to go and present herself to the king and identify herself. Up until this point, Xerxes does not know that she's a Jew, but to identify herself as to who she is. And there's a whole plot of intrigue that happens there. back and forth with banquets before she reveals what it is that is happening and who she is. And Haman is exposed. And as I said before, there's a way around these decrees. And so the way around it was the king gives Mordecai the authority to do what he had, what Haman had sought, but to do it with to Haman and his cronies, the people that are loyal, cronies that are loyal to him, and to do it before the effective date of the order that he gave to Haman. And so Haman doesn't wait around. He kills himself. Ironically, he does it on the implement that had been created or constructed to do Mordecai in. And they all live happily ever after that. The scripture that we have is from the 4th chapter. And this is when Mordecai has just learned that this order has been issued. And we have the first 5 verses of the 4th chapter. When Mordecai learned what had been done, he tore his clothes, dressed in mourning clothes, and put ashes on his head. Then he went out into the heart of the city and cried loudly and bitterly. He went only as far as the king's gate, because it was against the law for anyone to pass through it wearing mourning clothes. At the same time, in every province and place where the king's order and his new law arrived, a very great sadness came over the Jews. They gave up eating and spent whole days weeping and crying out loudly in pain. Many Jews lay on the ground in mourning clothes and ashes. When Esther's female servants and eunuchs came and told her about Mordecai, the queen's whole body showed how upset she was. She sent everyday clothes for Mordecai to wear instead of mourning clothes, but he rejected them. Esther then sent for Mordecai, one of the royal eunuchs whose job it was to wait on her. She ordered him to go to Mordecai and find out what was going on and why he was acting this way. So we have this story. I should have mentioned at the beginning that the book of Esther almost did not get included in the Bible. Do any of you happen to know the reason for that?
God is not mentioned.
God's not mentioned in the whole book. God's insinuated, but God is not mentioned, and God is not shown to be in action. And for that reason, it almost wasn't included. I think that what made the difference is the books of Ezra and Nehemiah that it's grouped together with, that it happened in the same time frame, one group being in Israel and the other being part of the exile community, just as a way of balancing out. I don't know if that had anything to do with it, but that's just something that stuck to me in my mind. But we have a classic story of being willing to put it all on the line to do something about people who are being oppressed. And this story resonates today as much as it has at any other time in history. And there are a series of questions that I just wanted to put before you and to leave you to think about as you prepare to listen to Pastor Dawn in our worship. How do we maintain our witness of faith in a culture dominated by material consumption and political brinkmanship? What power does any one of us really have to make a difference? What kind of risk are we willing to take on behalf of those vulnerable and threatened? Which of our identities ultimately shape our lives? Am I first and foremost a parent, an American, a Christian, an employee? What complicit agreements do we make with cultural or political powers to maintain our own status and privilege? How might God be preparing us to step forward to speak truth to power? Some soul-searching questions. But as I said, Esther stands out in our day and time. I mean, there's such a parallel there to things that we see going on in our world, in our communities today, that it resonates as much now as it ever did. Have any comments or observations before I close things out here?
I do. Esther, I can't remember if it was Esther who said this or Mordecai said it to her, but she said, or he said, perhaps that she had been born for such a time as this.
Mordecai said that.
Thank you.
I think so. That's
I think you're right, Cherry.
And that puts God right smack in the middle of it.
Well, you know who Mordecai is and his
Yeah.
faith.
Yeah. Well,
I tried to find that quote in scanning through it, and I didn't take the time to plug it in and ask for a search on it, but that occurred to me too on that, and trying to find out where it was at to include it there.
What kind of got me was that they didn't try to take that time to leave the country. Just like the immigrants trying to come into the United States now, they're leaving that country to keep from being in the situation they are in Honduras or wherever, and trying to get into the United States. These people apparently had time between the decree and when the action is supposed to take place. Well, they weren't even thinking about packing up and leaving or vacating the area so they wouldn't be killed. It's like, duh, I'm here, I'm sticking, I'm staying, even though I'm gonna die right here. That's the reason all of them were going through the mourning process. Like Mordecai was putting the ashes on because they knew death was imminent, but they weren't making any plans. Okay, well, we can go into the next country until this king dies, and maybe the new king might let us come back in.
but they had been taken from their country. They weren't just free to go if they wanted to go.
At this time, they were free to go.
No,
Yeah.
the ones who were given permission were free to go, but the ones who hadn't been given permission were not, I believe.
The way I understand it is Xerxes had allowed anybody who wanted to return.
Well, you're probably right.
But it's kind of hit me just in that, they weren't making any plans to try to get away. They were going to accept their fate as it was from a decree, and that might have not taken effect for another, month, 2 months, till after they let all the soldiers know, okay, these are the ones that are supposed to be annihilated. Get ready, it's going to have a lot of blood. And the people were still sitting there, okay, come on, I'm going to be here, I'll lay my head down for you. That type of thing.
But having the means and being willing to act on that, if they in fact had the freedom to leave, having the means and being willing to act on it or make it a whole different matter. I mean, you're not talking about hopping in a car and say driving to Canada.
Right.
You're talking about almost a year-long journey on foot through hazardous land to get back to Israel, and there wasn't any friendly area that they could just cross the border into. So it was been a major undertaking. But given that they have been given the opportunity, as I say, Ezra and Nehemiah record that, why so many of them remained in captivity has always been a puzzlement.
Doesn't it say in there, I could be wrong about this, but doesn't it say in there that they had kind of entered into the life of the land.
Mhm. That's in Esther.
So it would be harder for them to leave. I mean, they may have had, I don't know if they intermarried or not, but they might have had grandchildren who couldn't go.
It's almost a parallel to pre-Exodus
Yeah.
from Egypt with 8 plagues
Mhm.
to change the king's mind or the Pharaoh's mind. And
So
it parallels the same thing. You have Mordecai, you know, more or less the leading of the group, you know, and everybody was kind of follow his lead. And I guess because he was staying and accepting and covering himself in ashes and all, the other side they would do the same thing. Whatever little village or towns they were around there, they were doing the same thing, following his lead and stay. But yet, God didn't send a plague down to change the king, to make another decree and all that, except for Haman, and have him killed before the other decree would even take effect.
Well, it's a complex situation. It's not a black and white, but the answer is not as straightforward as it may seem in reading the story in hindsight. But it does pose, as I said, a lot of questions for us in our world today. Well, let me close. I hope you'll join us in our worship, and I want to close here with a word of prayer. Lord, we are grateful for this time together to acknowledge our grief, our fears, and our deep concerns for so many situations in our world. Help us to walk alongside one another, to lift our voices together. Help us to remember in both our joys and our deep sorrow, we are not alone.